Hello, so today we're going to talk about vaccination, and we'll look at various different vaccinations and how those can be used to control disease. We'll look at different types of immunity, so active, passive, natural and artificial immunity and how those work. And we'll also think about how new strains of influenza can actually come about and what our government then is doing to try and stop the spread of these new flu strains. So last lesson we looked at the structure of an antibody and how that relates to the function. So we talked about how it's made of 4 polypeptide chains. We've got a constant region, which is the same, variable region, which is the antigen binding site, and that's held together by disulfide bonds. And they can work in various ways. So these ideas that we looked at last lesson, and specifically that primary and secondary immune response then, are really important to understanding the vaccination process. So vaccination then is a deliberate exposure to antigenic material which activates the immune system to make an immune response and provide immunity. So you have to have a vaccination for a specific disease, and it will only protect you against that one particular disease for which you've been exposed to the antigen. It creates this artificial immunity, but it is active immunity because your immune system is triggered by it. So your immune system will now treat the antigen as it is a real disease, and it will create those memory cells, so it's going to provide the long-term immunity. So we've looked at the immune response in detail over the coming week. And you'll have exactly the same immune response. But the most important thing is those B and T memory cells that we've got that are produced as part of that immune response. And it's because of the B memory cells in particular that we end up then with this immunological memory as a result of the vaccination. So instead of the primary response where it takes a few days for that clonal selection process, and we only get a small concentration of our antibodies, and for this one we would have the symptoms there. Instead, because of the vaccination, we go straight to that secondary response. So we've already got the memory cells in our blood, and those then can differentiate straight into the B plasma cells and start producing antibodies straight away. They'll also divide by mitosis, but it means that that we can get a much higher concentration of antibodies, which rises much quicker, so we can fight off that infection before we actually get any symptoms. So we've got a variety of sources that we can use for vaccines. We've got whole live microorganisms that can be used for some diseases. We've got live attenuated strains, so those are harmless strains of microorganisms. We've got dead whole microorganisms, extracted antigens, and toxoids. So whole live organisms then, they'll give you a very small amount of that live organism. So it's just got a very small amount of the antigens, doesn't actually result in any symptoms. But it means that our body will trigger an immune response. And this is the most effective type of vaccination you can get, because it's going to simulate everything that you would have if you had a particular disease. So you have antigens there, you'll have all the toxins that are going to be produced, and it's living, so your body is going to be fighting that disease properly. So a good example of that is the vaccination that was designed for smallpox. So they managed to eradicate smallpox. In fact, it's a really amazing story through the process of vaccination. And polio, they are hoping to eradicate as well. So really effective type of vaccination. Then we've got live attenuated strains. So other things like measles, rubella, for instance, then what they would do is they will expose people to those particular microorganisms, but they're attenuated microorganisms, so they don't actually cause the disease themselves, but they will help to trigger an immune response. It is living, so it can reproduce as well, So that includes measles, the TB jab, so BCG, and the rubella jab as well. Again, pretty effective, but not as effective as the first one that we looked at with the live microorganisms, but still pretty good. Then we've got dead whole microorganisms. So dead whole organisms don't necessarily give the same kind of response because they're not living. So they're not going to be producing the toxins as actively, they're not reproducing. So although our body will actually fight the infection and generate that immune response, it's not as effective as the other ones. So they will use microorganisms that they've killed with heat or some kind of chemicals, but it's got those antigens, which is good. So we can trigger the response to antigens. We just won't be producing the same antitoxin that we would do if the toxins were being produced as well. So examples for that one are typhoid, cholera and whooping cough. Again, it doesn't mimic the microorganisms in the same way, so it's not as effective as other antigenic sources. And the other thing we can do is we can just get extracted antigens. So they can just isolate those antigens. And a good example of that are the flu vaccinations. So flu vaccinations, then, they will try, and governments need to try and predict what is going to be the next flu epidemic that we might have in the country. And then they need to make vaccinations. Usually the flu vaccine will contain a couple of different antigens because they're not sure exactly which of the flu strains is going to be more prevalent that year. And the flu virus itself can mutate quite quickly. So that's why we always need to have new flu vaccinations year on year. Again, it's good because we're being exposed to the antigen, so it will trigger an immune response, but it's not as good because it doesn't mimic what the pathogen does. It doesn't mimic the behaviour of the pathogen entirely. And as I said, because you get mutations, and influenza in particular can mutate very rapidly, you're going to have new vaccinations for new strains of that flu. So another example is a toxoid. So toxoids then are when we get exposed to a particular toxin. So we get vaccinated with a particular toxin that is produced by the pathogenic organism. So a good example of that is the tetanus injection. So tetanus vaccination will contain a small amount of the toxin that is produced by Clostridium tetani. Again, it is just the toxins, so we'll produce the antitoxins, but we won't produce other parts of our immune response. So we're only going to be producing that. So how effective? Well, it only is going to produce immunity to that one particular toxin and nothing else. And this does need to be updated. So boosters around about every 10 years. I'm definitely due mine. So vaccinations can be used in a number of different ways, and it depends on the situation. So we've got herd vaccination, we've got ring vaccination, and they'll use different things in different situations. So with herd vaccination, that's a preventative measure that is used. So things like TB, they had herd vaccination for that. The MMR vaccination, so measles, mumps and rubella, they use herd vaccination for that one. So that is where they will give that vaccination to the majority of the population in an area. And then that provides protection to any people that don't have that particular vaccination. And as I said earlier, we've had really, really good success rate with herd vaccination, and we've managed to actually eradicate smallpox. However, it took a lot of effort for them to eradicate smallpox. They had to vaccinate 80 to 85% of the world population. So not just in a small area, but the whole world needed to be vaccinated against smallpox. the moment, as I said, we've got other herd vaccination programs, so things like tetanus, whooping cough, polio, meningitis, measles, mumps, and rubella. Just to illustrate that, then this is the population without any vaccination program, and you can see we've got some people here that are contagious, and none of those people have got any kind of immunity to it, so they all catch that particular infection. Whereas here, we've had a large proportion of the population. Large proportion of the population then that has been immunised, and that provides protection then to other members of the population that are susceptible. So that's the reason why they do this herd vaccination program, to give this herd immunity and protect the majority of society. The other type of vaccination program that can be used then is the ring vaccination. So this tends to be a response. Say an epidemic starts in a particular area and they want to try and contain that epidemic to prevent it from spreading, then they can use this ring vaccination. So it's response vaccination. So what they'll do is, you've got infection in one particular area, and they'll then vaccinate in the surrounding areas to prevent that disease then spreading out of one specific area there. So all people in the immediate vicinity are vaccinated, e.g. in the surrounding houses or the whole town, to prevent the spread. So this is something that they try to use with Ebola. Ebola disease then took hold in Sierra Leone, they tried to prevent it from actually spreading out of Sierra Leone by using ring vaccination. Lots and lots of issues there, because the vaccination then they tried to create very, very quickly, and that meant it didn't go through all the same rigorous testing procedures that vaccinations would normally go through, and some people had side effects from those vaccinations. So ring vaccination can be good, but obviously it is good to test vaccinations properly first, to make sure that you know what any side effects might be. So pathogens do mutate, specifically things like the flu virus, they can mutate, and that means that we need to change that vaccination. So we will have, and I mentioned this earlier, a new vaccination, a new flu vaccination year on year. So we're going to look now at the different types of immunity. We can have natural immunity. So we can get immunity as a result of contracting a particular infection, which has generated an immune response. That would be natural immunity. We can have artificial immunity. So vaccines would be artificial immunity, where you've got deliberate exposure to antigens or the antibodies for a particular infection. So if you're given antibodies, we call that an inoculation as opposed to a vaccination. They are slightly different. Active immunity then is when your immune system is activated by lymphocytes, which will lead to that immunological memory. So you'll make those B and T memory cells, and they'll be circulating in the blood. And then you've got passive immunity. So this is when you just get antibodies not made by your system at all. So you could get that across the placenta, you can get it in breast milk, or you can be inoculated with antibodies. So it could be this artificial passive immunity, the inoculation with those antibodies. So overview of immunity then, you've got innate. So some people have the genetic factors that mean that they're immune to particular diseases. You can have acquired. So that's ones that you gain throughout your life. You can have passive acquired immunity. So natural, where you have maternal antibodies through the breast milk or over the placenta. Artificial then, when you get antibodies from other sources as well with the inoculations. You've got active then, when we generate our own antibodies. You can have natural active when you're exposed to an infectious agent, or the artificial, which is through the immunisation program, so vaccines there. Good. This TED Talk is definitely worth looking at. There are lots of really good TED Talks out there, so I would advise having a look at those. And if you've got any questions, you can email me or access me on Teams when we have our normal lesson times. Thank you. Bye.